Thanks a lot for the introduction, Benjamin. Indeed, very happy to repeat this presentation or do this presentation again with you and your students. I mean, be sure that, you know, when you're working in the field of impact investing, obviously we get caught very much into the execution and obviously making sure that we do capital at work for these particular topics. This is our core mission. But often made at the expense of, you know, lifting the head a little bit from the urgencies and sometimes forgetting to share the amount of knowledge and experience we gather. So rest assured, it is, I view this session as a very much of a both ways route. So I'm very happy to be able to share our experience and obviously also keen to have this opportunity to be in contact with you who will be the future players of this important space. So a great pleasure for me. I have shared in the chat, as you may see, a couple of links to EIF website, where if you actually look into those, you'll find certainly more information going forward. Also fair to say before I start that, again, this is a personal interest of mine and a great passion of mine. So if you are looking for additional information on the field, Benjamin has my contact and I'd be happy to make some time available to perhaps have a more direct interaction with those of you who are interested to answer questions and eventually suggest leads for future developments on the topic. Today, I will very much focus on showing and shedding light on what is EIF strategy in the field and trying to describe first what we view as being impact investing as opposed to other fields such as ESG investing or sustainable finance as a whole. Doing so, I'll also present briefly the different so-called financial instruments we manage in the space. So that means basically how we make sure that from the source of funding that are made available by policymakers, those funds actually reach their target and are invested in a way that do feel the social mission. Before I start, nothing better than interactive sessions. So please feel free to raise your hands, ask questions in the chat in the presentation. Obviously, if there are too many, I'll certainly park some of those for the end of the presentation, but please don't shy away from interrupting or asking questions in the middle of the presentation. Experience shows me that's always the best way to share knowledge. So on a personal note, I'm Cyril Guifes, 40 years old and a happy father of two, live in Luxembourg, French citizen. And I've been working with the Europe Investment Fund for the last 12 years. So a bit of a dinosaur, let's say already, in terms of working with the EIF. Prior to joining EIF, I studied political science, development economics, started my professional life working in microfinance institutions in emerging markets. That's how I entered the European Investment Fund by, in 2008, implementing some specific actions to support microfinance institutions in Europe. And the interesting bit, and perhaps that has to do also that maybe the common thread with impact finance, is that what I find interesting is that microfinance at the beginning was, let's say, a financial instrument that we owe certainly greatly to Mohamed Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and not Economy Prize, but Nobel Peace Prize. So what I found interesting and fascinating was that for once, it was a financial tool that was developed in emerging markets, so-called southern countries, and transferred into northern economies to see the value add that also more developed markets, as they call it, can benefit from very practical experiences from emerging markets. Because it's not, yes, indeed, Europe has certainly very different macro trends as Asia, Africa, America. But while globalization has, on the one hand, certainly contributed to reduce the difference between countries, that's a factual assertion, reduce the wealth difference between countries. When you look in the countries, difference or wealth difference, inequalities have increased significantly. So it is not because we are in a European context that microfinance, impact investing, and focusing on financing green social initiatives is trivial. We as well have a lot to do to improve lives of our fellow citizens in London, in remote rural areas, in Romania, and so on. So that's an important point to make. Now that I presented myself, a bit of focus on who the European Investment Fund is. You mentioned, Benjamin, in your session earlier that indeed a lot of the impulse was taken, let's say a lot of the impulse around awareness and making capital available for green transition and social innovation. It starts with policymakers, right? So the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, the European Commission in our EU galaxy. So the European Investment Fund, and by extent, the European Investment Bank Group, is not a policymaker. That's fairly important to stress. We are so-called the policy enabler. So that means the European Investment Bank Group is the financial arm of the European Union. So our role is to put into motion, to implement decisions that are taken by policymakers. So again, a few words on EIF. So EIF is part of the European Investment Bank Group. The European Investment Bank was created in the Treaty of Rome, or through the Treaty of Rome. And back then, the idea was very much around consolidating or making happen, favorizing the emergence of a unified market. So a lot of logistical investments, facility investments, such as highways, tunnels, or high-speed train railroads between member states. Obviously, over time, the mission has quite significantly diversified. In 1994, the European Investment Fund was created, whose core mission stands on two core pillars. First, increase access to finance for SMEs, and second, in Europe. So as long as you hear about European projects focused on backing European SMEs, that would most likely go through or be implemented by the European Investment Fund. We have two major shareholders, also important to stress in light of what you just said in your earlier session, Benjamin. First, the European Investment Bank for 60% of the capital, and second, the European Commission for 30% of the capital. So, by at large, European Investment Fund is a so-called implementing partner when it comes to put into motion European policies. We therefore, let's say, rely on both the EU central institutions, again, European Commission, Parliament, Council of Europe, but also member states. So we have two ways of, let's say, managing what we call mandates. Now, focusing more on, and perhaps just a word also before really focusing on EIF's impact portfolio. 2021 is a particular year for the EU galaxy, let's say, because as you may be aware, the European Commission works with so-called budgetary periods, 7 years programming budgetary periods. We are just out of the 2014-2020 period that was characterized by a number of political priorities, themselves translated into mandates and trusted by the European Commission, member states, to EIF to fill those political objectives. We are now entering the new programming period, 21-28, where, as Benjamin said, and as you've seen, a very significant emphasis is put on green finance, climate change, and social innovation at large. So this will be translated into a number of so-called mandates, and mandates are the resources made available by EIF's shareholders or stakeholders to address a number of policy goals. Finally, it is also important to stress that EIF in itself is a public financer. So that means at European scale could be compared with institutions like BPI France in France, KfW in Germany, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in Italy, for instance. So the public body in charge of implementing policy actions through financing. So now entering the field of impact investing, as I was just saying, and it is important to note because that sheds light on how EIF operates, there are two very interesting articles in EIF Statutes of Incorporation. One is about ensuring appropriate return to EIF shareholders. So here, that basically means we are not grant givers or providing subsidies, but we are in an investment remit. As such, EIF is a market player, and we do have a financial agenda. Next to this article, second article says that also EIF is in charge of pursuing the EU policy objectives. So very much in its DNA, the European Investment Fund walks on two legs. One is about making sound investment decisions to ensure appropriate financial performance to shareholders. And the other one is about pursuing policy objectives. So with no further ado, moving into the presentation, I'd like to start with sharing what is that we call impact investing, because impact investing is often referred to and is a bit of a trendy expression, which is good, but also comes with a number of attention points or threats. If we want impact investing to emerge and be faithful to its promises, there needs to be a very careful definition and measurement of so-called impact companies. Can you move to next slide, Benjamin, please? I don't think I have the... Yes, okay, I can also do it, sorry. So starting with the EIF Impact Toolkit, and especially on the definition side. I would wish to be able to drop questions to you, and I'd be curious to know whether yourselves you feel comfortable when it comes to make the difference between ESG investing on the one end and impact investing on the other. My experience tells me that even for professionals, so not only, that's not a question only for students, but also, thank you, Mark, but also for professionals in the field, there is a great deal of confusion. What characterizes impact investing is the intentionality to solve there is a clear intention to solve an identified social or environmental issue. So the reason why a startup is founded in the first place is, of course, to be potentially scalable and successful business, but first, or not first, but at par with this entrepreneurial ambition, there is a clear intention to solve a social or environmental issue. In ESG, we are more on a negative screening environment, meaning if you as an investor commit to ESG guidance or principles, that simply means you commit not to do harm with your investment. And again, no judgment. We do need strong ESG policies, but the intensity of the change is not the same. So while ESG investing would be being very transparent on what an investor finances and what are the externalities eventually linked with this investment activity, impact investing is different. The positive impact generated by a startup in the impact investing field is not an externality. It is very much the intention of the founder to solve a social issue. And this intention is verified by the theory of change that I'm sure you've heard of, which is basically looking at the whole value chain. So I, as a company, start with an input leading to an output and then an outcome and impact. So the idea of the theory of change is to identify a global social environmental problem, or actually regional to begin with, and break down this problem into different milestones, different steps that I, as a startup, commit to address. So the intentionality is key here. The scalability, second point you see on the slide, has more to do with a general investment practice. That is, and that's the overall idea of venture capital investing. You invest early in a startup that will grow, and over time, you expect to sell your shares from this startup to perhaps a larger player, which will be able to give more financial needs, more, let's say, softer resources such as network, sector specialization, engineer specialization, to put or to grow the startup at scale and to transform the startup from a full-blown company, eventually on track to become a large corporate. And we have a few examples in our portfolio that illustrate this. So second point is really around the scalability of the solution provided. Third, and this is a very important one, the correlation that has to exist between impact performance and financial performance. Let me be very clear, and again, no judgment here. We need a variety of players to foster social and innovation and improvement on the climate distress. Impact investing is no venture philanthropy. So this is an investment activity where next to the traditional financial metrics, you take into account the impact that is generated by the company, hoping that those two would be positively correlated. So that's, again, a very important point. We believe, and that's a belief we share with the funds we invest in and the startup we ultimately back, that investing in a company that has a clear social or environmental agenda or answer to a social and environmental issue does not mean that you need to compromise on the return, on the financial performance. To be slightly cynical, one could even claim that finding a solution to clean the ocean, finding a solution to make education accessible to all is a commercial opportunity. So that's a very important thing to bear in mind. And by the way, and that's also one of the reasons why I personally love this field, is that it brings around the table very different profiles. And that is basically, the idea is basically around putting all resources, even with different background, perhaps with different overall objectives, but put all these intention, resources, and steer them in the right direction. So that's one also very interesting field, because it helps us avoiding cliches and avoiding saying, I don't know, bankers are all crook and NGOs are whole world savers. This is actually, that's perhaps tempting, as you know, a binary way to separate the world, as we know very well, like many other things in private life, personal life, professional life, are not true. So that's a very interesting and strong point to make. Now, once this is clear, and again, please let me know if you have questions coming up. But now that we have here defined what what are the pillars behind our vision of impact investing, which is, by the way, our vision, but very much shared with a number of players. And Benjamin, you've mentioned a number of funds earlier in the presentation, with whom we are indeed in discussion to take an investment decision. So, because we are dealing with a very fragmented market, and outside of the impact space, that's a very common challenge when it comes to investing or financing in the EU, we need to have also, let's say, a definition of social SMEs or impact SMEs that can be articulated in a market such as the Spanish one, the Finnish one, the French one, the Hungarian one, and so on. And therefore, that does not mean we have a soft definition. It is a pretty stringent definition. Feel free to talk with some of the fund managers we are partnering with. They would certainly share that the EIF has a strong vision of what is impact investing, but it is a definition that is fit to work in very different markets. The first model would be here on the slide, the social, where that's, let's say, the heart of the target, and that's really the bullseye, to use a metaphor of what we intend to back. This means innovation through technology that fosters impact, that fosters improved social well-being or environmental action. So, for instance, what you see on the slide here, a company like Open Classroom is a totally online company that provides, with different type of registration, that strives to make education accessible to all. So you have free online courses. Next to it, you have also registrations which are diplomas, curriculum for which you need to pay, and that gives you a state-recognized diploma. It is the only company in France doing that. And it started in France. Now, for your information, has more than 10 million users in Africa, and is growing roughly its turnover 100% every year. So huge, fast growth example of a company that manages to very effectively address a social issue, education being accessible, and the strong positive correlation between the success, the growth of the company, and the value of the company, next to year after year an exponential outreach to a very diverse universe of students. Second model, let's say a traditional model run in a social way. So here, innovation and technology is not as important as in the first example. And to share what would be in this second bucket a typical company, let's take pizza delivery. Nothing particularly innovative, nothing particularly technological in there, but the way the pizzas are produced or delivered does create a tangible social impact. And obviously, in such companies, what is very important is to make sure that from the outset, there will be no mission drift. So our role, when we invest in the fund, and the fund relying on our capital investing in such companies, is to make sure that, for instance, in order to gain customers, to gain outreach, such a company does not decide to no longer work, I don't know, with perhaps people being traditionally excluded from the labor market. This represents also a very significant share of our portfolio. Finally, the geographically focused model is pretty remote from the first bucket, because it could be a traditional company running traditional business, but the place where the company is based does induce a very tangible social impact. One could think of, and that's particularly true in markets such as France, the UK as well, also Sweden, setting up a company in a given area does have a very tangible social impact in terms of employment, in terms of education, in terms of making available vocational training. So This hopefully helps you to understand what we mean by impact investing and what are the typical impact companies you would find in our portfolio. Here, a diagram on what is at large a summary of EIF's intervention on the market. We, EIF, are a wholesaler. That means we do not invest directly in companies. We are not equipped to do that. To give you a bit of an idea, today EIF counts with 500 staff, 500 employees. In the social impact team that I'm in charge of, we are 5 people. 5 people whose strong commitment is to make sure that those monies, those capital made available to EIF by EIF stakeholders indeed reach the market and indeed are put at work to solve social issues. So that means because we are set up and structured as such, we are not equipped to, I don't know, identify the most breakthrough startups in the suburbs of Sofia, in the city center of Stockholm or Paris. We are not equipped to do that. So we rely on national partners. In this case, looking at the social impact accelerator bubble here, targeting social impact funds, we invest in social impact funds, and our due diligence will be obviously focusing on a number of topics, but certainly the first one is the ability of the team to identify those startups in those markets. So this is one of the core reasons we are set up as a wholesaler. And we invest through the social impact accelerator. Our fund of fund for impact is the first and to date still the only one to systematically invest in impact at European scale. We also invest in, as you can see on the diagram, payment by results scheme or social impact bonds that I get back to in a minute. And at the bottom, incubator or accelerator linked funds, meaning here the idea is for the payment by result or social impact bond, be active and make sure innovation also takes place in the way social sector organizations are financed. And on the incubator accelerator side, here the idea is to make sure that there is a flourishing deal flow and, let's say, particular focus, particular capital and advisory available for those entrepreneurs who may have a good idea but don't know where to start. This is the idea of those 3 mandates or those 3 financial instruments we manage in the impact investing space. So shedding light on the first one, the social impact accelerator. To be clear, today the social impact accelerator is fully invested. So we raised this fund of fund in 2013, 243 million. And we have, let's say, fully invested this fund of fund in July 2019. So in 6 years, invested in 18 funds. I'll get back to that in the next slide. And we are now raising the successor of this fund of fund. So fact is that this is the way we operate. I hope it's clear for everyone as a fund of fund. This is a snapshot of our portfolio in the social impact space. We have invested in 18 funds. Out of these particular fund of funds, as a whole in EIF, we have invested in more impact funds, but I spare you the details of too much inside in our internal kitchen, let's say here. But that gives you also a good overview of what an impact fund looks like. And especially if you look at the investment curve, you see that we raised in 2013 the social impact accelerator. In 2014, because we have identified a number of intermediaries to invest in when raising the fund and when doing our market research, invested at a good pace in 2014, 2015. And then you realize that 2016, 2017, fewer investments back to a larger critical mass in 2018 and 2019. This is a very fair reflection of the evolution of the market. Today, the market has nothing to see compared to what it was 10 years ago, meaning much more fund managers, much more impact fund managers active on the market, many more entrepreneurs, and certainly some of you here listening in will be the future entrepreneurs that come up with this bright idea we all strive for. But when comparing the number of entrepreneurs going on the market 10 years ago and nowadays, this has considerably increased, considerably increasing. And when you take a deeper look at who are the entrepreneurs nowadays getting to the market, we can see that while perhaps 10 years ago, and to be a bit also generalistic, 10 years ago, perhaps the idea behind an entrepreneur willing to set up a company was to create a successful business and eventually spend the rest of his life in the Caribbean, drinking cocktails. Fair enough. Changed quite a lot since then, because more and more entrepreneurs are setting up their company. Yes, obviously to be successful, nothing wrong with that, but also being successful through addressing a clear social and environmental issue. And I think the generations coming up now as entrepreneurs, and let's say such as you entering the labor market, are way more conscious than what past generations were around, especially climate change and also social inclusion as a result of a decade of repeat crisis in our economies. So moving on to shedding light on what an incubator accelerator or what the incubator accelerator facility looks like. Also, please bear in mind that we operate as a fund of funds, as a wholesaler. So we invest in an incubator, an accelerator. You know a number of them, I'm sure, in your respective regions. If I'm not mistaken, Benjamin, also Audencia is active on providing advisory to entrepreneurs. So here the idea is for us to invest or create sometimes out of the blue. So meaning there was non-existing before. An incubator was perhaps focused on providing advisory or making available a network of experts to future entrepreneurs that have a bright idea, perhaps a couple of PowerPoint slides, but have not started. The idea of an incubator accelerator is to provide this advisory to entrepreneurs. With this facility here, the idea is that next to advisory, also a pool of capital is created, made available, so that the advisors of the incubator accelerator also have the means to invest what we call, or to invest seed financing in this company. So at proof of concept stage, even the company has any profits, and furthermore any revenues. At this stage, an incubator with this facility can sign the first commitment and be the first investor in the company. That is very important if we want the market to follow its growth path and to nurture the deal flow of successful companies of tomorrow. Second, and the social impact bond platform, and that is slightly more, or that's a very different animal, let's say, because as opposed to a fund of fund activity, or as opposed to a fund investing in an incubator, a social impact bond, and Benjamin knows that very well, is a party, or let's say a setup where you have at least three players: investors that take the risk and finance upfront the working capital needed for the social sector organization that you see in the yellow box here to operate and deliver on its social mission. And investors in a social impact bond scheme are reimbursed, eventually also with a premium, with some, let's say, on top of the capital invested, also some profits by the commissioner. And the commissioner in this space is the central state, the region, the municipality, because that commits to reimburse investors if the social targets are met by the social sector organization. Why do they do so? Why would they wish to do so? Why on earth a public like ministry, region, department, municipality would pay private investors with a profit for a social intervention? Well, why do they do that? Obviously, not because they are totally mad or not because the world has changed so much that the reason why they do so is because it creates savings for public budgets. So, for instance, a department in France, let's say a department which is, for instance, in charge of paying all the allowance linked to being unemployed. Such a department has an interest next to the social interest, obviously financial interest, in having less and less unemployed. If they have less and less unemployed, obviously first and foremost will have an interest in improved well-being, improved inclusion through employment, but also for the budget of the department, it would mean less payments for unemployed in a given location. So this is why, in a nutshell, commissioners next to investors and social sector organizations have an objective interest in jumping into this kind of financial schemes. So I'll leave it here now. I see in the chat, thank you, Benjamin, that you'll have next week a dedicated session on SIVs, and pay attention, obviously, to this one, because that's a pretty, that's a real breakthrough, not so much in what the social sector organization does, but rather on how social sector organization can get financed to deliver their action. So now, spotlight for the next 5 to 10 minutes on our impact measurement, because obviously this is very much in the DNA of impact investing. Why on earth would we call this impact investing if an impact investor is not able to demonstrate in an objective, scientific way how much its investment improved a given social or environmental issue? So here, a lot of text in there that in any case you will have at hand, I understand, because Benjamin has the presentation, but rather than simply reading the slide here, let me focus on what it is important, why it is important. What we implement with our methodology is the following. In a traditional fund setup or venture capital setup, let us never forget that impact investing is like a subset of venture capital, even if it has many implications. It remains about investing in a startup, grow it, grow the social mission, grow the success of the companies, and then sell your shares to a bigger player who can grow the company even further for better social outcomes and greater financial performance. What prevails outside the impact investing space and in a traditional venture capital setup is that if a manager investing in 10, 15, 20 companies is successful in his investments, the profit that he will make as a manager out of this investment activity, well, obviously the profits are also shared back to investors who have taken the risk in the first place, but part of these profits are also going to the fund manager because he's been successful in the way he made his investment decision. And this is the so-called alignment of interest. Let's say we as fund manager, our daily job is to receive fund proposals that we screen and we decide yes or no to invest in this or that fund. When in such a setup, what is important under this alignment of interest is basically to say, well, guys, you are seeking an investment from EIF. Well, so it is as if you ask us to jump on the boat. We are willing to jump on the boat if you demonstrate that yourselves, you are also on the boat. So in other words, even if the manager is responsible for the investment decision of a fund, it also needs to be aligned with investors in the sense that he has a financial downside in case the fund does not perform well. So in the impact space, we make it slightly different. And again, we are always humbly trying to improve this methodology, but we are the first development finance institution, multilateral institution in the world to systematically implement this so-called impact-based financial incentive, meaning that when we invest in an impact fund, if a fund manager creates a great deal of profit out of his investment activity, but falls short of its impact targets, social and environmental impact targets, then the manager would not have access to the financial incentive. So it is a pretty profound game-changing exercise that we implement through the methodology that is described here. It is basically around three principles. The fund manager, when we invest in a fund, for instance, we decide to invest 15 million in a 30 million fund in, I don't know, Hungary, and this fund will invest in a portfolio of 20 companies, we ask the fund manager the following three things. First, the manager has to commit to define 1 to 5 impact indicators per company. Second, on each of those indicators, set up quantifiable targets at the moment of the investment. And finally, third principle, commit to report to us, so to share on an annual basis the following information. Let's say how much in a given year for all impact indicators from the portfolio the companies are doing toward their target. So here, that gives us so-called multiple. Clear example, a company does create a marketplace or a job platform to foster handicap or to provide access to labor market for handicapped people. One indicator could be number of employment created for handicapped people. Second, the target, let us say, for instance, 100, for the sake of using here simple figures. And we would year after year look at how much the manager is able to meet his target. So we will have perhaps in year one, the company creates 20 jobs after first year of operation. Here, the impact multiple would be 0.2, meaning 20 is the achieved value in year one, 100 is the objective. For this year, the impact multiple would be 0.2. The second year, the company is improving, increasing, and gaining scale, so manages to create 50 jobs for handicapped people in year two. Here, the impact multiple would be 0.5. And with this, we get to such scorecard that would be a good, fair illustration of what an impact fund portfolio looks like, let's say in year four. We compile all the multiple that you see in the first column, indicator multiple, that have different weighting. For instance, a company that does both, let's say, job creation for handicapped people, but also perhaps mindful of its CO2 footprint. The most important with such a model is obviously the creation of handicapped people, so maybe a weighting of 80% of this indicator, and a second indicator around CO2 reduction that would count for 20% rating. So here we get to third column, a company impact multiple, which is the average between the different impact indicators. And to get to a portfolio impact multiple, we average all company impact multiples weighted by the amount invested in the company, and that leads or gives us a portfolio impact multiple. And finally, depending on how much your portfolio impact multiple is, the manager would be or not be entitled to receive its financial incentive or carried interest. So there is no conclusion slide. This is the last slide of the presentation, and obviously, obviously, I'm taker of any question you have, and in any case, again, I hope the presentation was clear. It's been a pleasure to share that with you, ladies and gentlemen, this morning.
Thanks a lot, Cyril. Very interesting. Just maybe to start the question and then let our student contribute. You know, when I worked in Citizen Capital a few years ago, when I was younger, we were one of the very first impact investing funds to I would say, share our carried interest. Because we had a very good deal in one company, what I presented in my course with the student in G2J.
Yes.
And it was very interesting, but very complicated topic, because the question was to share the bonus, the carried interest with the staff of the company. But then we had to build the rules, how to share. Do we have to include in this movement the staff who left the company just a month ago, but they were present during 5 years during the portfolio when the company was in the portfolio, etc. So, how did you? What did you see? I mean, on the impact investing market during the last years in terms of practices for carried interest? How do you contribute to this thinking, etc.?
Well, it's a very thanks, Bernard. Very good question, and a very always a heavily discussed topic in the negotiation, in the so-called due diligence. And fair to say, a great deal of different views, even exclusively on the French market. You will find players that have very different views around the carried interest. And again, let me here share my personal view. So perhaps leaving my EIF hat for a little while here, but starting with a core so-called industry principle. I was referring to this alignment of interest. In the venture capital space, investors always cherish the alignment of interest principle, which means basically, okay, you as a fund manager are approaching us for an investment. We decide to invest 15 million in a 30 million fund, but we do so only if you personally, as a team, invest, I don't know, 500,000, 1 million collectively into the fund. So this is the best, or this is viewed as one of the best way to ensure the manager and investors have the same objective. Well, in the impact space, because impact investing is has very much emerged from venture philanthropy, let's say, some players do not see carried interest as allowing virtuous behaviors. Some would say, you know what, I'm investing in impact businesses, social businesses, environmental businesses. I am not in here for the money. I am in here for the change that it can trigger. Well, I also personally, I am personally convinced that, especially in this space, people are not aligned through financial interest exclusively. Otherwise, there are plenty of other jobs to do, to be chosen. But there is, and that's why, again, it is so important. I'm so glad to be able to talk with you, who will be the entrepreneurs of tomorrow, the financiers of tomorrow. Fact is that in the impact investing space, some would say, I do not use any carried interest. I do not want to have any carried interest. Some others, perhaps coming from the venture capital space and now focusing on backing companies that matter, let's say, would say, yes, of course, I want to have a carried interest. This remains an investment activity. I am no foundation. And next to the tangible positive impact I want to have on the market. I also want to be incentivized through the carried interest. Also fair to say that in the industry, also, let's say, when you look at impact investing trends, there are very different financial dynamics that in the venture capital space. So to your question, Benjamin, we see a mix of, very clear venture capital practices transferred into impact investing, and others who say, well, basically, we do not believe in carried interest. To complement my answer, the world is also changing fast and the market is changing fast. And I would say that because of the professionalization of the sector, of the impact investing sector, carried interest is more and more viewed as a tool to virtuously align managers and LPs. Now in the case, so I would say the trend is that more and more carried interest is indeed used as a financial incentive, provided, and this is very much a huge share of our role on the market, provided that you trigger the carried interest with the right indicators. And that's what, in my view, the impact methodology we implement is so important. And finally, clearly, Citizen Capital is one of the very few funds that share its carried interest with portfolio companies. This practice exists, and I think for the sake of the alignment of interest, so not only between the investors and the fund manager, but between investors, fund manager, and founders, this is a very interesting lead to structure. However, as you said, and commonly referred expression, the devil is in the detail, implementing this at portfolio company level can also lead to very complicated situation and even conflict situation. That has to be managed in a very careful way. I see I have a tendency to speak long and give long answers to short questions, but looking at the question, are you optimistic? From Mark, are you optimistic about the future? Do you think that growth will? Yes, well, that's a good question. Definitely, I am optimistic about the future, and precisely because mentalities are changing. And that leads me very optimistic on the genuine commitment of market players to address impact issues, and because not only investors are more and more keen to make money care more, but also entrepreneurs, as I was saying earlier, are more and more sensitive, and that's certainly a generation phenomenon, to social and environmental issues. So that leaves me optimistic. Now, and to be, again, to perhaps share more of my personal view, we also have to be humble. Impact investing on its own, same as microcredit on its own, will not solve all the world problems. So the positive element I see in impact investing is that it uses traditional tools of our capitalist system, free trade-based system, to shift the financial resources to more meaningful purposes. And in other words, why I'm optimistic, I might be slightly naive, I fully assume that and recon that, but engaging into an investment activity where from the outset the purpose is to create financial profit will no longer be possible in the future. Generating profit for the sake of generating profit is what put us in this situation in the first place. So from a social point of view and an environmental point of view, if you are only after financial profits, well, this is for sure going to be at the expense of society and the environment. So the path and the journey will be long, but certainly in my view, that is the strong promise impact investing is bound to deliver. That it is about combining in the investment decision, not only financial indicators, but other indicators, and with a genuine intention to solve through technology, and technology that, by the way, is more and more affordable, more and more widespread, positive social outcome. again, I think it's a very long debate that you're throwing here, Mark. I would love to take it further and perhaps in a more even informal setup. But this is what leaves me optimistic. Also being aware of, you know, the major forces that drive our world. So we have to do something about it. Certainly, impact investing is a very interesting path to pursue. Looking at Maya's question, because you said it from now. So that's again a very good question, Maya. Sorry. In other words, does the EIF play a structural role in the impact investment strategies in Europe? Again, and to be also very honest, that's perhaps because I do not have a venture capital background, but I would say in general in the venture capital space, venture capital market, humility is not the most common quality, rather the other way around. Again, personal judgment here, but let us be humble. I am convinced that we are setting up guidelines and practices that will allow impact investing to strive. This I'm sure. And obviously, because of the amount of capital we invest every year on the market, we do no doubt have a structural role on impact investment strategies in Europe. So this is a firm belief we have, myself, the team as a whole, and this is why obviously we negotiate day after day when we invest in a fund, those principles that I just listed for you. Now, also fully aware that there are other approaches, other methodologies that exist in the market that we perhaps do not know enough yet. And again, huge responsibility lies with you, ladies and gentlemen, to make it happen. So as much as I'm convinced we are doing the right thing for the flourishing of the impact investing, also fully recon that we have to keep agile. We have to stay informed and in tune with what's going on the market to make sure we actually keep the agility to stay in tune with the market and steer it the way we believe it should go to. Another question from Camille: how does EIF check that projects receiving funds? Yes, so when we invest in a fund, we sit on the advisory board of the fund, as you know, and that's a very particular prominent feature of the equity and fund business. You, as an investor in a fund, do your due diligence, and once you decide to invest, you are on for a 10-year journey where, by law, you cannot influence the investment decision of the fund manager. So you better be very sure you embark on this journey with the right people. So this is how we get the comfort that the strategy presented by the team in due diligence will be implemented in the next 10 years. So for this purpose, we have a reputation of being a very demanding investor and for having very thorough due diligence. This is where we get this comfort from. And obviously, the quality of my colleagues who are real experts, really real experience on the market, very different markets, I'm convinced we get to that level of confidence. To do so, obviously, we are very closely involved with the European Commission task force on the taxonomy, on the InvestEU scorecard. We are one of the implementing partner of InvestEU. So when I was saying earlier that 21 is a transition period for EIF, this is precisely because as we speak, we are negotiating the mandates and the impact scorecard with the European Commission so that it gets translated in our investments going forward for the period 21-28. And finally, I would want to again refer to, I think, an attitude that is always very important to have in professional life. No matter how confident you are on your role, you need to stay humble. So yes, we make sure when we invest that we take the best possible decision and that we have checked everything. Now, it can happen that here and there, we are not, let's say, for some companies invested by our funds, we perhaps tend to not understand the impact indicators that they have retained, or not understand the impact nature of the business model retained. And that's why our role, sitting on the advisory board of the fund, is very important, because we would, in this 10-year journey, give a constant feedback to the fund manager to make sure, let's say, the fund manager stand on his heels and gets ready to be challenged by EIF as an investor on the investment decision he took. I hope those answers were in line with what was expected. My pleasure. Thank you, Camille.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Cyril. Time is done. Also, maybe if there is one more and last question, it can be welcome. But if no, I think one more time the session is finished. So thanks a lot. Thanks, really huge thanks, Cyril, for your discussion contributions. And
thank you, Benjamin. I was glad to be here. Really,
to see the change, including in the EIF perspective and action, because it's very interesting to see today, but it's very interesting to see the journey. So the last decade is very interesting, and probably the next one will be very fascinating.
I would expect so. And just on that note, and again, I don't want to jeopardize or hijack your conclusion, Benjamin, but an important message I'd like to convey is that, again, this is our vision as EIF and as the major investor in the impact space in Europe. It is our vision that impact investing is not a niche market. Impact investing is rather a way, it's not a sector, it's a strategy. And this strategy is going to spread or contaminate, spread, let's say, contaminate those days is a bit of a tricky verb to use, but
positive
let's say that the best practices that are used by impact investing players, we hope, or our vision is that it will spread to also mainstream venture capital players, on the belief that it is not enough to invest with a financial agenda. Fewer and fewer investors are going to be able to go out and pride themselves of their financial performance if they are not able to demonstrate, okay, what was next to this financial performance. So we hope that's really also the development path and the future, and reason to be optimistic for the future.
Great. So I think it's the perfect positive view to conclude this session. So thanks one more time, Cyril. Thanks you all for attending this session. I see you next week, if I remember well, for conversation, especially on social impact bonds. And I see you all. Thank you very much, Cyril. Is it possible to share? Can I share your slides with the students?
Of course you can. That's again my pleasure. Very happy to have had this session. You can share the slides, Benjamin. Please feel free. And also, well, I cannot commit to answer to any questions if I'm flooded with questions. But please feel free to use my contact details, email address if you have a sharper question on the industry. I'd be happy to follow up.
Great. Thanks a lot, Cyril, for this. See you all. Have a good day, and bye-bye.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.